Hello everybody, welcome to our final video lecture of the term. So today we are going to take a look at Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. Now Young herself, 20th century philosopher, really political theorist, notable for a number of different works that she produced, unfortunately passed away earlier this millennium, I guess. Now, what Young herself is really thinking about in this piece are ways in which people, as members of certain groups, as we're going to see, can wind up being oppressed within a liberal democratic society in ways that are not intentional. So when we were looking at Mill last time, really, Mill is arguing in favor of certain relatively strict limits in terms of what governments can coerce people to do. And overall, Mill really argues that there should be some pretty serious limits on the ability of a government to coerce people to do anything or other. Now, Rawls and Nozick agree with that, and I think generally speaking, most of you, and me included, think that individual freedoms are good things. It's a good thing that the Canadian government or government of any country you might live in, hopefully, can't tell you things like what sort of religion you can practice or what sorts of clothes you can wear or all sorts of other things. It's good to have a lot of individual freedom. What Young is exploring in this piece are some of the potential drawbacks of individual freedom. Now, in this piece, she's not advocating for any particular way of solving those, but arguably some kind of government intervention could be a good idea. Now she's not really explicitly arguing that here. We could seek other sorts of remedies as well if we agree with Young's analysis. So ultimately, really what Young's point is here is pointing out certain ways in which people can be oppressed within a liberal democracy without anybody intentionally trying to oppress them. So when we think about oppression, we think about people being held down or limited or having their freedoms reduced in a certain kind of way, we can easily think of direct oppression. You've got some kind of tyrannical power holding people down intentionally. So think about a dictatorship or something like that. We can think about this in terms of one individual oppressing some other individual or small group of people. If we're thinking in larger terms, probably what we have is some kind of group. Say you've got a dictator and their cronies, right? Their sort of criminal enterprise holding down an entire country and the citizenry within it. But we can also have another form of oppression. So we can have this kind of direct oppression. This is really the kind of thing that Mill and Nozick and Rawls were thinking about in some sense, that we certainly don't want this. And broadly speaking, I think we can generally agree this kind of direct oppression is a bad thing. We want a free society. There's the question of what exactly that means, or what does that entail? If we give people a lot of individual freedom and discretion in terms of what they're going to do with their lives, and wealth and so on, what might the result be? Well, this is where we can get indirect oppression or structural oppression. Now, this happens when the everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society result in oppression affecting an individual or a group really as a kind of byproduct. So, and this is really Young's focus in this piece. So when we have structural oppression, what's going on is that due to these everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society, the everyday practices of individuals like you and me making decisions that we think are good for us, that are in our own self-interest, or even we think are good for at least some other people around us, a result of those practices in general can be that certain people or groups become oppressed as a kind of unintentional byproduct. So, and this is really Jung's focus. So Jung is not arguing in this piece that what we have going on in Canada or any other liberal society that you might want to pick out, say the United States or something like that. And she's really focused more on the United States. That's really her context. But we can apply the same kind of analysis to other countries. And there's always the question about whether or not there are relevant differences. But so keep that in mind. There's always this question of to what extent does this analysis really apply in practice? But it's a very interesting way of thinking about these things, which I think certainly reveals something interesting that at least can go on within a liberal democracy. So what we have here are really free people going about their lives, making decisions that they think are good for them, good for people around them, perhaps, right? But certainly are not intentionally engaged in actively oppressing people. That's not their goal, right? What's going on is that people who aren't dictators or tyrants or anything like that are going about trying to lead a good life as they see it. And the byproduct of this, when we look at a society as a whole, can be this sort of oppression. Now, in Jung's view, this kind of structural oppression really affects social groups. Now, of course, it affects individuals as well, but it primarily affects social groups. And it's because people belong to social groups that ultimately individuals get affected by it. So, of course, there's this interesting question, what is a social group? How do we define that? Because it's, in some ways, very tricky to actually figure out where groups stop and start. So the way she puts it, and I think this is a fairly nice way to put it, a social group is a collective of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life. So this is a pretty broad definition. We get, social groups are a kind of group, and they are differentiated from each other by cultural forms, practices, or ways of life, which are really features of a society. So if we think about different societies in general, across the world, if we talk about different societies, we can think about them in terms of these cultural forms, practices, and ways of life. What is it like to be a Canadian or an American or a German or a Brazilian or Egyptian or whatever it is, right? We can point to some features like this as ways of picking those out. And they can include things like diet, hobbies, cultural practices like greetings and so on, celebrating certain holidays perhaps, interests. It's fairly large spread. But the basic idea is that even within a given society, say within Canadian society, we can still pick out different social groups within that. So you can have, in some sense, subgroups, or maybe not subgroups, but you can have different groups within a given state. And of course, the members of the groups interact with each other. They're not totally separated off or anything like that. And so we can think of having different groups and the individuals who make them up interacting with each other. Now, when I was just saying that individuals make up the groups, Jung actually thinks about this both in terms of individuals make up the groups, but groups also make up the individuals. And if you think back to earlier in the term when we were looking at Held was making a very similar point. That in fact, who we are is not something that just sort of springs out of nowhere. We don't just appear fully grown with no background or history or connection to groups. Instead, who we are is really made up, at least to a large extent, by where we come from, the sorts of groups that make us who we are. And so Jung puts it this way. She says, a person's particular sense of history, affinity, and separateness, even the person's mode of reasoning, evaluating, and expressing feeling, are constituted partly by her or his group affinities. Now, not every group that we belong to makes up part of who we are, at least not in a very substantial way. So you can think about, if you belong to a gym or something like that, or you're a student in this particular class. Is that really an important feature of who you are as a person? Probably not. But then again, we might have instances where somebody is really attached to their gym. That in some sense, that's a part of their family. They spend all sorts of time there. They've got deep connections with the people who are in it. So on a case-by-case basis, you might actually have something like different degrees of importance attached to different sorts of groups for different individuals. Now, really what Jung is thinking here is that it's these social groups, things like coming from a certain background, say, you know, my case, being Canadian. Now, I'm still not entirely sure what exactly that means, but in some sense, that's important to me. If I move other places, you know, I move around the world, I find myself in different situations and so on, even if I explicitly don't attach too much importance to being Canadian, the fact that I was raised in Canada, that my relations are largely Canadian, not exclusively, but many of them are, the fact that I was born here and I was raised here has had a serious impact on the way I reason and evaluate, express feeling, the sorts of customs, practices, ways of life that I find normal. It's helped form my habits. Of course, there's plurality within Canada. It's not like all Canadians are exactly the same. But we can point to something like being Canadian or Greek or Ethiopian or, you know, Japanese or whatever it might be, as having some kind of important impact on who we are. And this is really what Jung wants to analyze. How different social groups in that sense help formulate who we are, and how well-intentioned acts can have deleterious effects or negative impacts on social groups and their members. And so, of course, I'm pointing to things like nationality here, or that sort of background, but we can think in other terms. We can think of religious background, sexual orientation. So, of course, we've got these questions of culture, perhaps ethnicity. There's some interesting questions about how to draw the lines between some of these things, or whether or not it even makes sense to talk in some of these terms. So these important group features and how they help constitute who we are. This is really the level on which Jung wants to conduct her analysis. So rather than trying to trace lines of oppression between particular people, instead step back and look at the bigger picture in society, really taking a look at how the actions of individuals who make up one group can have impacts, for better or worse, on individuals in another group. And ultimately, she's trying to find instances where what we have is oppression happening between groups. So you've got one group, and you know they're well-intentioned, they don't mean to be oppressing the other group, but through their own free actions, right? Ones that the government isn't telling them what to do, but it's actions they themselves decide to undertake out of their own self-interest or whatever, end up having the side effect of oppressing members of another group. So the 5 faces of oppression Jung examines, that's what we're into now. So we've got, in some sense, the background all set up. Now she wants to look at these 5 different ways that groups can be oppressed and their members can be oppressed unintentionally. Now, there is overlap, and she says that group members can be oppressed in multiple ways. So being oppressed in at least one of these ways is enough to make you oppressed, but different groups can suffer different forms of oppression. You can suffer all 5, you can suffer 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. You can also suffer none. And in that condition, presumably you'll be not oppressed unless there are other forms of oppression that she hasn't articulated here. So the first form of oppression is exploitation. This occurs when someone's capacities are exercised under the control according to the purposes and for the benefit of other people. Now, one thing I'll mention here, I'm not going to belabor the point too much. This is the sort of analysis that Karl Marx was really interested in when he was really developing theories of socialism and communism, especially with Friedrich Engels. And they were primarily interested in analyzing exploitation between classes. So the bourgeoisie, or the owners of the means of production, things like factories or owners of property and so on, and the proletariat, or the workers, so the people who actually do the work, who actually produce the goods. What Marx and Engels argued is that the people who actually do most of the work wind up not getting much of the benefit. In fact, most of the benefit goes to the people who own the means of production, right? So the people who own the business or the factory or whatever, sure, they do work too, maybe, maybe not, but they wind up getting the lion's share of the benefit of all the work that the people who do in the factory or the business or whatever it is wind up doing, right? So you can have a situation where you have a business, let's just say it makes $1 million a year. The employees of the business might make, right, $1 million a year is profit. Right? Let's define that. So this is after all costs are covered and so on. Well, out of that, $1 million a year, perhaps the employees only get $100,000 or a couple $100,000, and then the owner gets all the rest of it. Now, the question Marx and Engels were really trying to raise is it morally justified that the owner gets that much? Systems of property, systems of ownership are human inventions. These are things that we have come up with. There aren't just sort of rights floating around out there that say, yes, that person is entitled to all of that benefit. They say that's really a matter for us to decide. You can think about this in terms of spilling over into that debate between Nozick and Rawls about the distribution of property as well. Now, like I said when we were talking about Rawls is no communist. He doesn't think perfect equality is the right answer. Inequality can certainly have its benefits, but Rawls thinks that's the right way to think about it. What are the benefits of inequality? Let's only tolerate inequality insofar as we're deriving some kind of benefit for it. Now, bringing this all back to Young and sort of setting aside Marx and Rawls and Nozick for a moment, when she's talking about it here, she's really thinking again in terms of groups, but instead of just thinking about workers versus owners the way Marx and Engels did, Young is really just thinking in terms of social groups. So she's really just interested in trying to put her finger on and point out that what you have in a 20th or 21st century liberal society like the United States or Canada, or pick your example, you have some groups who, okay, all the groups are presumably working in some sense, but the benefits, the primary beneficiaries of the work of some groups can actually be people in another group. So you get exploitation when you get a steady process of transferring the results, right, the benefits of work from one group to another group. And so she points out, for instance, and these are really her main examples, but she draws on several of them throughout the piece. If you look through a gender lens or a racial lens and you pick out different sorts of social groups in that kind of way, she says you can actually trace lines of exploitation where the benefit of the work done by certain gender groups or racial groups wind up being people from other gender, other racial groups. So overall, she says, just as an example, she says, look at the service industry. Right? So the sorts of jobs that she says are by definition servile, unskilled, low-paying work, lacking in autonomy, in which a person is subject to taking orders from many people, right? Working, say, in food, or working in anything where people come in, tell you what they want, and you, in effect, have the job of pleasing the customer. You've got to, give them what they want, you take orders from them, you get paid really to be a servant in a sense. And of course, we could think about these sorts of jobs as well. We can think about them in a directly oppressive or tyrannical form, right? If you are a slave and you're forced to take orders and do things that please people and so on, we'd obviously look at that and say, oh, well, you're oppressed and there's something unjust going on here. Now, when we look at a free society, like Canadian society, where there is no slavery, right? Nobody is owned by somebody else. But if you want to stay alive, particularly if you want to do well, you need some kind of work. And as a matter of fact, the kind of work that many people are able to get can be this sort of work. And she says, if you look at this sociologically, you find that women and people from minority racial groups wind up being overrepresented, my apologies, really per capita in these sorts of service positions. So what do you have here? Really, you have members of these groups winding up in these sorts of jobs, and the benefits of their labor effectively wind up going to people in other groups, right? So the people in these positions aren't the primary beneficiaries of their own work. It's the people who own these businesses who tend to do much better than the people who are, say, doing these service jobs. Right? And this is not, so one thing I'll just add for clarification here, something Young is not trying to do in this piece is somehow undercut or underplay the work that people who say own businesses do, or the sorts of risks they take by owning businesses. You know, she's not making an argument here that somehow people who do well are evil people, right? Or that they're bad. This is the whole point of that early discussion about group membership. And that what she's really analyzing here is that in a liberal society, when people are just trying to, you know, they're acting freely and they're trying to do well for themselves, as a byproduct of those actions, you can actually have oppression between groups, right? So if members of one group are making certain sorts of decisions that make their life go better, that can come at the cost of members of a different group having their life go worse, even though that's not the primary intended effect of the decisions of the first group, right? What the first group wants is just a better life for themselves, right? And the people they know and their family and their friends and so on. But that can come at the cost of a worse life for people in a different group. Okay, so exploitation is the first phase of oppression. This is really where you know, the capacities, the work that people in one group do primarily benefit people in one or more other groups. A second and related form of oppression is marginalization. This is where, instead of people being exploited by the sort of labor system within a society, instead they're actually excluded from that dominant system of labor. Right? So marginalization in some sense is almost the reverse of exploitation. Exploitation, people are there and they're working, but the fruits of their labor are being largely gained by some other group. In marginalization, you have people who are just excluded from participating in the labor market generally, and so are expelled from useful participation in social life. Of course, having a job, having an income, gives you a certain kind of social status. It also helps give you choices, because if you're excluded from the workforce, if you're excluded from having something like a good, steady income, then you're going to lack certain material goods, right? There are things that you just can't buy or can't do, and this impairs autonomy. And this was something that I mentioned when we were talking about Rawls and when I was talking in large terms about liberalism versus libertarianism. If we're interested in freedom, there is a difference between formal freedom, you know, legally being allowed to do something, and substantive freedom, actually being able to do it. So look, there is no law against me, well, I don't know, opening some business if I had $1 million, right? Now, of course, I don't have $1 million, so I can't actually make that choice. I can't choose to spend $1 million to open some business. There's no law against me, I don't know, taking a trip around the world or something like that. I don't have the money to do it, though, right? There's no law against me, I don't know, buying a bigger house than I have. But I don't have the money to do so, right? And on and on and on. There's no law against me, I don't know, buying a new car. In fact, I want a new car, but I don't have the money. So I can't really make that choice, right? So it's this issue here of the difference between being allowed to make a choice sort of in theory, or actually being able to make a choice in practice. When members of a social group are marginalized and thus excluded from useful participation in social life and actually participating in the dominant system of labor, ultimately what they're going to lack are material goods. They're not going to have wealth. And with not having wealth comes the lack of ability to actually make certain sorts of choices. Say, save for a rainy day, or save for your retirement, or right, we can think about those sorts of decisions. We also think about things like taking a vacation, taking some time off work, right? Being able to take some time to help a family member in need. Sometimes these are just not real options for people because they just don't have the resources to try to do it. Now, one way to try to offset this kind of marginalization, where people are excluded from regular work and the sort of participation in social life and the sorts of material benefits that come with that when they're cut off from these sorts of things, are wealth transfers. And here again, we could think in terms of roles, having some kind of coercive system of wealth redistribution, where you have taxes, some scheme of taxation, you take money from people who have it, and you give it to people who don't, to try to offset some of this inequality, right? And try to bring it into a little bit less inequality, so people who are worst off are doing better than they had been. Now, we can do that, right? And as a matter of fact, in most countries, you have this sort of thing, particularly the sorts of liberal free countries that Young is really thinking about here. But with that kind of transfer tends to come even more reduced autonomy, because those transfers tend to come with certain sorts of strings attached. There are questions about how people who are receiving these sorts of benefits are spending their money. There are social attitudes that come along with these. And as Young talks about in the piece, often there are lots of probing questions and really invasions of privacy that you have to, in a sense, open yourself up to examination by the state or its officials in order to actually qualify for these sorts of transfers. And that really reduces the ability of people to make certain choices for themselves as well, and to govern their own lives, because now they are really being turned more and more into subjects of state control. Now, related to marginalization and sort of exclusion from social life that can bring is powerlessness. Powerlessness is really this lack of authority, status, and sense of self. Now, we can think about this in terms of working conditions. Within working conditions, within a work environment, we can think about people or groups who are powerless as really being people or groups that lack the ability to have professional development over time. So we can think about the difference between a job and a career, right? A job is something you go to and you make some kind of wage, but over time, there aren't really prospects for advancement, right? This is really, a career is that sort of thing. A career has prospects for advancement, growth. Over time, you're probably not only going to make more money, but really, in some sense, advance through the ranks. Whereas if you just have a job, that's probably the sort of thing where that doesn't happen. You might get a little bit more money over time, but you're going to wind up at the end of your working life doing effectively the same thing you were doing at the start of your working life, right? So there isn't that same sense of advancement. There are also questions about work autonomy, right? What sorts of choices do you get to make within your own work? We think back to the example in exploitation about people in a service industry. They have very little work autonomy overall. They do what their boss tells them, and they do what customers tell them, or perhaps ask them to do, though it's certainly been my experience where I've seen both, of course, very polite and nice customers, as well as ones who are not so very nice and polite. So there are these questions about work autonomy. How much choice and self-governance do people really have in the work that they're doing? So taking at one end of the spectrum, say, people who have very little autonomy, say in service industries, where they're just constantly doing what other people want them to do. That's just what their job is, and they don't really have much say in what they do, when they do it, or even how they go about doing it. Often even that is dictated to them by either a customer or some sort of manager. By contrast, I have a very high level of work autonomy. So here I am making this video. just thinking within the context of our course here, basically the constraints I have to work within is that our course is an introduction to philosophy. That's about it. Everything else is on me, for better or worse. So if you're looking for anybody to blame for any faults in the course, here I am. That said, if you've enjoyed the course, you think it's been interesting, thought-provoking, you've enjoyed the materials or the assignments or anything like that, well, I get the credit, or at least some of it. I can't take all of it because what I do and the choices I make have been influenced by all sorts of people who have influenced my development over time. But I get to choose. I get to choose what the slides are like, what the readings are, what sorts of assessments we have. I have a very high level of work autonomy. Now, of course, ultimately I'm accountable to some people in some fashion. So it's not to say that it's just a complete lack of accountability, but there is a high level of autonomy in the sense that I have a broad range of freedom in deciding what I do, when I do it, and how I'm going to do it. There's also the question of respectability. People who are powerless tend to lack respectability, whereas people who are powerful tend to have it. And you can think here, and Jung points to this sort of example, just in terms of even attire that people wear when they go to work. You know, somebody who wears a suit or some sort of, formal dress or something when they go to work versus somebody who wears, overalls or sort of work clothes like that. And she points to examples here where people who have less power tend to try to emulate people with more power when they're seeking respectability. So say somebody who works in a job where the attire is sort of less formal, if they go to a bank or something, and they're seeking a loan, typically they're going to try to dress in a way that emulates more powerful people. So taking something like a suit or that sort of formal attire as the correct way to dress when dealing with certain sorts of matters and certain sorts of powerful people. There's also just the general societal attitudes towards people who hold different sorts of positions as well. And here again, you can just contrast something like, say, somebody working in the service industry with, say, a lawyer or a priest or a doctor or whatever it might be, right? We can think in terms of the various levels of prestige that come with different sorts of positions. Now, just, this is really, picking up on something I've already mentioned, but when we're thinking about workplaces, they tend to be hierarchically organized. So most workplaces, and maybe this is changing these days, but certainly when Jung was writing this piece, most workplaces are hierarchically organized in the sense that the farther you are sort of up the, how do I even want to put this? The more senior you are, the more orders you give. And it's precisely that sort of structure. It's the giving and taking of orders that characterizes most workplaces, rather than having more democratically organized workplaces. Right? So if we had a democratically organized workplace, then presumably people could come together, vote on what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and when they're going to do it. Right? They could have a real say and real input into the give and take of how that business is going to operate. But as a matter of fact, what typically happens is that people at the top really issue orders. They might seek advice and so on from other people under them, but they really tell other people what to do. And so there is in effect this sort of chain of command. People at the bottom who tend to come from certain groups, right? And this is really what she's talking about with exploitation, tend to be on the receiving end of those orders and really have very little say into what it is that is going to happen. And this is part of what contributes to their lack of autonomy, as well as lack of respectability, because they really don't have much, if any, say over what they do and when they do it and how they're going to do it. And just as a sociological phenomenon, particularly in places like the United States or Canada, what you wind up having are white men being largely represented in positions of authority within these sorts of environments. So you have these hierarchical organizations with white men really being in charge. And so again, if we're thinking in terms of social groups, you've got white men as being the typically most powerful groups, also typically the beneficiaries of work from people in other groups. Now, one other thing to note here is that even though I've stuck this here, Young is not saying that all white men or all members of one social group are always the beneficiaries of the work of all people in some other social group. So the claims aren't universal like that, right? And in fact, even issues about, say, if we want to think about white men as being a particular kind of social group, Young says we can actually distinguish within social groups, and depending on how we're thinking about the groups, we can carve them up. Because of course there are also white men who are oppressed in certain sorts of ways. And in fact, we can think about, just say like impoverished Caucasian people, right? That happens too. So we can think about, say, the wealth divide between members of what in some sense would be one social group, right? We could think about, say, I don't know, Canadians of European heritage or Americans of European heritage or something like that. We can think about it broadly in that way. We can think more narrowly about people who have sort of like English heritage or something like that. We can think about the divides between rich and poor within some sort of ethnic or historical national group like that as well. So we can divide these lines up in different sorts of ways. We can think in terms of ethnicity or nationality, religion, wealth, right? There are different ways of thinking about what these groups really are. And the really important point here is that Young is just not making universal claims that all members of this group are exploited and all members of that group are the exploiters and so on. Rather, it's tracing these sorts of lines of oppression that can occur really as this byproduct of people just seeking a good life for themselves and trying to make choices that benefit themselves. Okay, cultural imperialism. This is experienced when the dominant meanings of society render the particular perspective of one's own group invisible at the same time as they stereotype one's group and mark it out as the other. Now, really what she is thinking about here, in particular she's talking about the other, we're thinking about us and them. We're thinking about that kind of group membership and that way of viewing the world. Now, whenever we're thinking in those sorts of terms of us and them, of course, we're always an us, we're never a them. And so there's always the question of who they are, right? Because they are the other. They're something different from us. So there are always these questions about what sets them apart. This is really what she's talking about here. And so, of course, if you just look through popular culture, you look at movies, television, literature, et cetera, what do you tend to get? Well, if you look at any given society, there tends to be some dominant social group within it, and they tend to dominate the cultural sphere as well. So literature, television, movies, music, etc. Now, what's going on here in cultural imperialism is, again, it's not intentional. That's not really what Young is trying to point out, although arguably there could be that sort of thing as well. But really, what do you have going on? Members of some dominant group choosing, right, just based on their own preference or what have you, choosing to engage with and support cultural products that are reflective of their own experience, right? So what you tend to get, say, if we just take movies or something like that, what do you get in movies, Hollywood movies, let's say? Let's just take that big sort of thing. Well, and of course things have changed since Young wrote this, at least to some degree, but this is still this live issue. This is something that's going on these days, right? And you're probably aware of it to some degree. No matter what your view on it is, this is probably something you are somehow aware of, which namely is this question of, if we just look at, say, movies, who writes the movies, who directs the movies, who produces the movies, who stars in the movies, whose stories do most movies tell us about? Who are most of the protagonists in movies? Well, if we look at, just sort of Hollywood, and when we take the United States as, at least in the Western world, sort of the primary production house of movies and film, what do you largely get, or what have we largely gotten throughout the past? Well, stories about white Americans, right? You get stories about America, about Americans. They tend to be, white, of some kind of European background and so on. Now, is that to say that there are no people from other social groups in those movies? Well, and these are real interesting historical questions and good questions for film studies. But if you just sort of look through the history, look through 20th century film, what do you tend to get? Well, in earlier decades in the 20th century, it is very predominantly narratives and stories about white people. You get members of other social groups appearing as other characters, right? Side characters, sidekicks, comic relief, or villains or something like that. Now, that does shift over time, but even now, here in the 21st century, if we just do a kind of head count, now I haven't actually done this, so this is probably something worth looking up if you're interested in these sorts of matters. In a given year, how many movies are there that have a protagonist or a main character that is, somebody from one of the non-dominant groups? So they're a female protagonist or a member of a visible racial minority. That's the main protagonist. Now, of course, there's been an increasing number of characters from other sorts of social groups within movies and being represented to some degree. But there's still questions about, the writing, directing, producing, and starring in movies, and what sorts of stories they center on. Now, of course, we could look at some high-profile counterexamples as well, which you can, right? So again, the claim is not some sort of universal claim. Oh, there are no movies that have, writers or directors or stars or something that are members of the non-dominant group. It's not that, but rather what you have is really this control over the cultural sphere, which again is to some degree unintentional, because one way of trying to defend that sort of dominance is by saying, well, look, the reason that there are so many movies starring white people and focused on the narratives of those sorts of people is because those are the movies that make the most money. If that's the defense, then in some sense that's just making Jung's point for her, right? It is it's not the intentional creation of oppression that she's trying to analyze, it's the unintentional creation of it. So just by people from a dominant social group wanting to, say, see movies that are reflective of their own experiences, that highlight their own group while making it visible or somehow othering or setting off members of another group, right? If that's what they want and that's what they just choose to go pay for, right? That's what the free market provides, people going and paying money to see these sorts of narratives that exclude certain groups and highlight other sorts of groups. It's creating this cultural sphere that has this kind of imperialism or oppression within it as a kind of byproduct. It's not that people are going to the movies and saying, yeah, I really want to oppress members of some other group, so I'm going to go watch this movie. Rather, it's just people saying, oh, I want to go watch this movie because it seems to speak to me, it seems the one I'm most familiar with, it seems most entertaining or gripping or whatever it is, right? That can be the primary intended reason for, say, wanting to see that sort of movie. But the byproduct of that choice is that other voices can be sidelined or silenced. Now we come around to violence. And this is really just systematic violence that occurs to people due to their group membership, right? As Jung puts it, this includes random, unprovoked attacks on their persons or property which have no motive but to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person. And we can think here just in general hate crimes, right? Hate crimes against, say, religious groups, defacing a mosque or a synagogue, right? Or tombstones of people of certain religious groups, persecutions and violence against homosexuals, say, Indigenous people, particularly here in Canada, murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls. We can think about how law enforcement resources are utilized as well. What sorts of cases are investigated? What sorts of cases aren't? What sorts of cases come up where the reaction is something along the lines of, well, you know, these things tend to happen to those people an awful lot, so there's not much point in trying to actually stop them, right? This is just a common feature of the world we live in. Those sorts of people are victims of those sorts of crimes, and there's just no way we can really reasonably stop them with the sorts of resources we have. So really, I think a very easy way to think about this is hate crimes. Here again, Young is not making some kind of universal claim, right? All members of one social group commit hate crimes against members of some other social group, or even that all members of some social group are going to experience these sorts of crimes. But rather, it's questions about what in general can we say. Look, I live in Canada, and I am a white male, middle-aged, able-bodied, heterosexual Canadian. I am at probably the smallest chance for experiencing a hate crime based, or experiencing violence based on my group membership as anybody I could think of. It just doesn't really occur to me that this sort of thing could happen. It's just not part of my lived experience that at some point there's going to be a cross burned on my lawn, or my property is going to be defaced, or that I'm going to get attacked because of my, say, you know, race or sexuality or religious beliefs or anything like that, right? This is just not a feature of my life. And for not having that feature, my life is fairly privileged. And so, of course, there's this whole discussion for thinking about oppression, and then we think on the other end about privilege. One way to think about privilege and really what that is, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, is really to be free from certain forms of oppression, right? So this really leads us into this last point out of Young, that we can have these various forms of oppression work together in a sense. So you can have members of a group oppressed in one way or more than one way. And these different types of oppression combine to oppress different groups in different sorts of ways. And like I said, we can even think about different social groups and sort of carve them up in different sorts of ways. So one individual can belong to all sorts of different social groups, and so experience different forms of oppression based on their membership in those different kinds of social groups. So she says, for instance, working class people are exploited and powerless, right? But if employed and white, do not experience marginalization and violence. So there are really these questions about how individual people fit into different sorts of groups, and the sorts of oppression that people who belong to those sorts of groups tend to face. Now, just going back for a moment to that very brief mention of privilege, one way to think about what privilege is just being free from certain forms of oppression. So look, I'm no millionaire, right? I wasn't born into a family that was, you know, had some kind of big historical wealth or anything like that. That said, I'm still privileged. How? Well, look, I had a loving and supportive parents. I was not really a victim of these forms of oppression. What did that result in? My own ability to work hard and to benefit from the fruits of my own labor, to put time and energy into myself, to not be, in some sense, held back or held down by factors outside of my control. Now, I still had to work my tail off to get where I am, and I still work an awful lot to maintain the position I do. But I'm still privileged because I have the luxury of doing that, right? By not experiencing these forms of oppression, I am privileged in the sense of being able to work hard and to be the primary beneficiary of the fruits of my own labor. Now, even that, arguably, depending on how far we want to take some of these analyses, isn't really true. For how hard I work, have I really been the primary financial beneficiary of all the things I've done throughout my life? Probably not. Even today, am I the primary beneficiary? I keep tripping over that word, of the work I do. Well, maybe, maybe not. And then we'd have to get in some sense, get our hands dirty here and doing an analysis of what I do and the sorts of market forces at play and how much tuition you pay and how much I should get out of that, how much the university has to take and how much it costs to run the place and everything. And so we start getting into some pretty complex analyses when we're trying to really figure out what does it mean to not, say, be exploited at all. Ooh, good question. Even if we can't answer that really good question, we can still think in terms of more and less. And we're thinking in terms of more or less. If we look at something like Canadian society or Canada as a country and think about all the different sorts of groups within it, I am privileged in the sense that I don't really have to deal with these various forms of oppression on a regular basis. And just from that fact alone, I can say with some degree of confidence that I am a privileged person. Now, is that because some particular group has intentionally tried to create conditions where I will do better than other people? No, not necessarily, certainly. And this is exactly what Jung is trying to get to. Sometimes these forms of privilege and oppression get created merely as byproducts of people trying to make free decisions to make their own lives go as best as possible. Sometimes when we make those sorts of decisions, we can make other people better off as well. But sometimes we might put ourselves ahead of other people, or by making a decision that's good for us, we're actually doing something that's bad for other people. This brings me back to what I was talking about right near the start of the video. How do we try to combat these forms of oppression, or what do we do about them? One option is trying to do things through, say, the legal system or through the government, trying to combat forms of oppression. So you can have things like hate crime legislation, which imposes more serious penalties for acts of violence motivated in certain sorts of ways. You can have, say, legislation dealing with employment opportunities or giving marginalized people wealth transfer payments somehow, right? We can try to do that through the state apparatus. We can do that through the government, through the legal system. We can also try to do it privately, right? We can think in moral terms. We can think in terms of charity. Perhaps not even charity, but just acts of justice that themselves are not done within the legal or political arena. Now, Jung herself isn't advocating any particular solution here. I'm not either. I'm just saying that if Jung is correct that in fact these forms of oppression exist due to these sorts of well-intentioned acts of free people that she's pointing out, then we can think in terms of both, one, are there further limits to individual freedoms that justice would demand to end these forms of oppression, and these would go beyond Mill's harm principle? Or perhaps we could even think that Mill's harm principle itself would say that certain free acts aren't allowed if, as a byproduct of those free acts, certain people are oppressed and thus harmed by them, right? So that's one way to think about it. A second way to think about it is really this moral question of, if Jung is correct in her analysis here, what sorts of obligations do each of us as free citizens living within a liberal free society, what sorts of obligations do we have, moral or political, to do something about it, or to keep it in mind when we're making choices that we think primarily affect only us and we're thinking about our reasons for them, and what other alternatives we're presented with that we could actually make other choices that might make people other than ourselves better off, perhaps while not even sacrificing anything of that much importance to us. Now with that, that's really all I got to say about Jung, and that really concludes our examination of the course material, at least through this format here. Thank you very much for a wonderful term. I didn't think we'd be finishing off in this sort of virtual way. Sorry not to see you all, and to wish you all the very best of luck moving forward with your lives and with your final projects, final exams and everything. But it was a real pleasure teaching you. You've been a great group. I've been really impressed with the caliber of engagement I've seen coming out of you with the course material, both in discussions and your written work. Your abilities on the tests have been wonderful as well. So overall, you've just been fabulous. It's really been a pleasure teaching you, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of Sean as well. Sean and I have talked on a few occasions about how impressed we both are with you collectively as a group. You've been really wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and I hope you've enjoyed our term. Best of luck on all your final exams and final assignments, and I hope you are doing wonderfully and that you have a wonderful summer moving forward. Hopefully, I'll see you another day, but until then, bye for now.